The morning frost painted delicate patterns across the windows of a state as 8-year-old Prince George wandered through the grand corridors. It was December 23rd, and the royal family had arrived for their traditional Christmas gathering. The ancient estate buzzed with preparations, servants hurrying between rooms carrying decorations and gifts, while the aroma of festive baking filled the air. George had always been drawn to the quieter corners of the estate, places where he could escape the constant attention and formal expectations that came with his royal status. His curious nature often led him on solo adventures through the sprawling grounds, much to the concern of his protection officers who struggled to keep pace with the energetic young prince. That particular morning, while his parents, Prince William, and were engaged in meetings about Christmas Day arrangements, George slipped away from the main house. He had discovered something fascinating the day before during a family walk, an old chapel tucked away in a grove of ancient oak trees, about half a mile from the main residence. The Gothic structure, built in the 14th century, had been used by previous generations of royals for private prayer and reflection. The chapel stood like a forgotten jewel among the bare winter trees, its stone walls weathered by centuries of English weather. George had been captivated by the intricate carvings around the doorway and the mysterious atmosphere that surrounded the building. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had mentioned during dinner that the chapel held many family secrets and stories from generations past. As George approached the chapel that frosty morning, his breath formed small clouds in the bitter December air. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, and a thin layer of ice covered the stone steps leading to the heavy wooden door. The young prince wore his favorite red coat, warm gloves, and sturdy boots, but even bundled up, the cold seemed to penetrate through to his bones. The chapel door, massive and ancient, stood slightly ajar. George remembered his father mentioning that the building was rarely locked, as it was considered sacred ground that should remain accessible for family members seeking solitude. The heavy iron hinges creaked as George pushed the door open wider, the sound echoing through the silent countryside. Inside, the chapel was even colder than the winter air outside. The stone walls and floors seemed to radiate a chill that had been building for months. Weak December sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn wooden pews and ancient altar. The space felt both beautiful and eerie, filled with the weight of history and the presence of countless family members who had sought refuge here over the centuries. George walked slowly down the narrow aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He was fascinated by the memorial plaques on the walls, bearing names of relatives he had only heard about in family stories. The chapel seemed to whisper with the voices of the past, and the young prince felt a deep connection to his family's legacy. Near the altar, George discovered a small wooden chest that he had not noticed during his previous visit. The chest was ornate, carved with the same intricate patterns that decorated the chapel's doorway. His curiosity overwhelmed any thought of caution as he knelt beside the chest and carefully lifted its heavy lid. Inside, he found a collection of old prayer books, religious artifacts, and what appeared to be personal letters tied with faded ribbons. The items seemed to glow in the colored light streaming through the windows, and George felt as though he had discovered a treasure trove of family history. He began carefully examining each item, losing himself in the mystery and magic of his discovery. Time passed unnoticed as George explored the contents of the chest. The chapel grew colder as the weak winter sun moved across the sky, but the young prince was too absorbed in his findings to pay attention to the dropping temperature. He had found what appeared to be a journal written by one of his ancestors, filled with stories of Christmas celebrations from over a century ago. As George sat reading by the dim light filtering through the ancient windows, he heard a strange sound from outside. It seemed like the wind at first, but then he realized it was the unmistakable sound of the chapel door closing. The heavy wooden door had been slowly swinging shut due to the wind and the slight slope of the building's foundation. The young prince looked up from the journal, suddenly aware that the chapel had become much darker. He set down the old book and walked quickly toward the entrance, but when he reached the door and tried to push it open, it would not budge. The ancient locking mechanism had engaged when the door closed, trapping him inside the frigid chapel. George pushed against the door with all his strength, but the heavy wood and iron construction made it impossible for a small boy to force open. He called out, hoping someone might hear him, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the thick stone walls. The nearest buildings were far enough away that his cries were unlikely to reach anyone, especially with the wind carrying his voice away from the main estate. The reality of his situation began to settle in as George realized he was completely alone and trapped in a building that rarely saw visitors during the winter months. The temperature inside the chapel continued to drop as the day progressed, and he began to shiver despite his warm clothing. The ancient building had no heating system, and the stone construction seemed to amplify the cold rather than provide any shelter from it. George tried to remain calm, remembering lessons his father had taught him about staying composed in difficult situations. He knew that panicking would only make things worse, and he needed to think clearly about how to escape or attract help. He explored every corner of the chapel, looking for another exit or a way to signal for help, but the building had only the one entrance, and the windows were too high and narrow for him to reach or climb through. As the hours passed, George's situation became increasingly desperate. The cold was becoming unbearable, and he realized that his family would eventually notice his absence, but they might not think to look for him in such a remote location. The chapel was not on the usual patrol routes of the estate's security team, and it was far enough from the main buildings that casual searches might not extend to its location. The young prince huddled near the altar, trying to conserve body heat while fighting off the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about his family, probably beginning to worry about his whereabouts, and wondered how long it would be before someone found him. The chapel that had seemed so magical and inviting just hours before now felt like a prison, cold and forbidding, holding him captive as the winter day slowly faded toward evening. Back at house, the afternoon had progressed with the usual royal efficiency. Princess of Wales had been reviewing Christmas Day schedules with the household staff when she realized she had not seen George for several hours. Initially, she assumed he was with his father or perhaps playing with his siblings in one of the many rooms throughout the sprawling estate. When William returned from a meeting with estate managers, casually asked about their eldest son's whereabouts. The look of confusion that crossed William's face immediately sparked concern. Neither parent had seen George since breakfast, and their initial assumption that he was with the other had proven incorrect. What had started as a minor question about their son's location quickly escalated into genuine worry. The couple immediately contacted the royal protection officers who were responsible for monitoring the children's activities. The security team, highly trained professionals who took their duties seriously, were alarmed to realize that Prince George had somehow slipped away from their surveillance. In their defense, the young prince had become quite skilled at finding ways to explore the estate independently, and the Christmas preparations had created more distractions and movement throughout the buildings than usual. A systematic search of house began immediately. Every room, closet, and hiding spot that George had used in the past was thoroughly checked. The staff joined the search, examining everything from the kitchens to the attics, while outdoor security teams began sweeping the immediate grounds around the main buildings. The estate's extensive CCTV system was reviewed, but much of the property, particularly the more remote areas, was not covered by cameras. As the search expanded, found herself struggling with a growing sense of dread. George had always been adventurous, but he was also responsible for his age and rarely stayed away for such extended periods without telling someone where he was going. The fact that he had been missing for several hours without anyone noticing made her feel guilty and terrified in equal measure. William coordinated with the head of security to organize search teams that would cover the estate's extensive grounds systematically. Spans over 8,000 acres, with numerous buildings, gardens, and wooded areas where a small boy could easily become lost or trapped. The teams were equipped with radios and had specific areas assigned to ensure no location was overlooked. Meanwhile, George's situation in the chapel was becoming increasingly dire. The temperature had continued to drop as the afternoon progressed, and the stone building seemed to trap the cold air like a refrigerator. His warm clothing, adequate for a brief outdoor adventure, was insufficient protection against the prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures in the unheated building. The young prince had tried everything he could think of to escape or attract attention. He had shouted until his voice became hoarse, pounded on the wooden door until his hands were sore, and even attempted to move the heavy wooden pews to create a platform that might allow him to reach the high windows. Nothing had worked, and each failed attempt only served to drain more of his energy and body heat. As the search teams spread across the estate, they followed established protocols for locating missing persons. The areas closest to the house were searched first, followed by the gardens and recreational areas where George was known to play. The teams called his name constantly, hoping to hear a response that would guide them to his location. One of the search teams, led by a senior protection officer named Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell, decided to extend their search to some of the estate's more remote historical buildings. She had worked with the royal family long enough to understand George's fascination with the older, more mysterious parts of the property. Her instincts told her that if the young prince was going to get into trouble, it would be while exploring somewhere he found particularly intriguing. Detective Inspector Mitchell's team included 2 other officers and a groundskeeper named Thomas who had worked at for over 30 years. Thomas knew every building, path, and hiding spot on the entire estate, and his local knowledge had proven invaluable during previous searches for everything from lost pets to visiting dignitaries who had wandered off during tour. As their search expanded beyond the main grounds, Thomas suggested they check some of the older buildings that were rarely visited during winter months. The chapel was on his list, though he considered it unlikely that a young boy would venture so far from the main house, especially on such a cold day. However, his experience had taught him that children often did exactly what adults considered unlikely. The search team moved through the bare winter landscape, calling George's name and listening carefully for any response. The wind had picked up as evening approached, making it difficult to hear anything beyond their own voices and the rustling of bare branches overhead. The temperature was dropping even further, adding urgency to their mission. Back in the chapel, George was experiencing the first stages of hypothermia. His shivering had become violent and uncontrollable, and he found it difficult to think clearly. He had curled up in a corner near the altar, trying to use the wooden structure to block some of the drafts that seemed to flow through gaps in the ancient stonework. His fingers and toes were becoming numb, and he could no longer feel his face. The young prince had tried to stay awake and alert, knowing instinctively that falling asleep in such conditions would be dangerous. He recited lessons he had learned in school, songs his mother had taught him, and family stories he had heard at dinner tables, anything to keep his mind active and focused. But as the cold continued to sap his strength, maintaining consciousness became increasingly difficult. George's cries for help had become weaker and less frequent as his voice gave out and his energy waned. The sound of his calls barely carried beyond the chapel walls, and even if someone had been nearby, the wind would have made it difficult to determine the direction of his voice. He was trapped not just by the locked door, but by the isolation of the building and the harsh winter conditions. As Detective Inspector Mitchell's team approached the area where the chapel stood, Thomas paused to listen carefully. His years of experience had taught him to use all his senses when searching the estate grounds, and something about the stillness around the old chapel seemed different from the natural quiet of the winter landscape. He could not pinpoint what had caught his attention, but his instincts told him they should investigate the building thoroughly. The team approached the chapel as the last light of day began to fade from the sky. The building looked peaceful and empty in the gathering dusk, giving no outward indication that anyone was inside. The searchers had called George's name hundreds of times throughout the afternoon, and their voices were becoming hoarse from the effort and the cold air. Thomas noticed that the chapel door was completely closed, which seemed odd since the building was rarely secured during family visits. The door was typically left slightly ajar to prevent moisture buildup inside the ancient structure. This small detail, which others might have overlooked, raised a red flag for the experienced groundskeeper. As they drew closer to the chapel, Thomas thought he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it sounded like a human voice. He held up his hand to signal the others to stop and listen, straining to identify the source of the sound. The team stood in absolute silence, their own breathing seeming loud in the still air. Then they heard it clearly, a weak cry for help coming from inside the chapel. Detective Inspector Mitchell immediately radioed the other search teams and the main house, while Thomas rushed to the chapel door to begin the rescue that would save Prince George's life. Thomas' hands shook as he grabbed the heavy iron handle of the chapel door, though whether from cold or adrenaline, he could not tell. His 30 years of experience had prepared him for many situations, but finding a member of the royal family trapped and potentially in life-threatening danger was unprecedented. The door mechanism, which had locked when the wind blew it shut earlier, now seemed impossibly stubborn as he struggled to force it open. Detective Inspector Mitchell immediately called for emergency medical assistance while helping Thomas with the door. The ancient locking mechanism had engaged fully, and the cold weather had caused the metal components to contract, making the door even more difficult to open. The two other officers in the search team positioned themselves to help, while everyone called reassurances to George through the thick wooden barrier. Inside the chapel, George heard the voices of his rescuers like sounds from a dream. His hypothermia had progressed to the point where his thinking was severely impaired, and he was not entirely certain whether the voices were real or hallucinations brought on by cold and exhaustion. He tried to respond, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper, and his body no longer seemed to obey his commands to move toward the door. The young prince had been trapped for over 6 hours in conditions that would challenge even a healthy adult. His small body had lost a dangerous amount of heat, and his core temperature had dropped to levels that threatened basic body functions. He lay curled in a tight ball near the altar, his expensive winter clothing now inadequate against the bone-deep cold that had invaded every part of his being. Thomas finally managed to work the lock mechanism free, using a technique he had learned during his years maintaining the estate's many historical buildings. The door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges, and the search team rushed inside to find George collapsed near the altar, barely conscious and shivering uncontrollably. His lips were blue, his skin was pale and cold to the touch, and his responses to their voices were slow and confused. Detective Inspector Mitchell immediately began first aid procedures for hypothermia while coordinating with the medical team that was rushing to their location. She carefully checked George's vital signs and found his pulse weak and irregular, his breathing shallow and labored. Her training had covered cold weather emergencies, but seeing the young prince in such a vulnerable state made the situation intensely personal and frightening. Thomas wrapped George in his own heavy coat and carefully lifted the boy, speaking to him constantly to keep him awake and responsive. The groundskeeper had raised 3 children of his own and understood how to communicate with a frightened and confused child. He told George that his parents were looking for him, that help was coming, and that he was safe now, even though the boy's condition was far from stable. The team's radio crackled with urgent communications as news of George's discovery spread throughout the search operation. Prince William who had been coordinating search efforts from the main house, immediately demanded to be brought to their son's location. The head of security had to balance their parental rights and concerns with the practical need to clear the area for emergency medical treatment. Meanwhile, the estate's medical team, led by Dr. James Henderson, who served as the royal family's primary physician during their stays was racing across the grounds in a specialized vehicle equipped with emergency medical equipment. Dr. Henderson had been briefed on George's likely condition and had prepared warming equipment and medications that might be needed to treat severe hypothermia. As they waited for medical help to arrive, the search team focused on beginning the warming process that could save George's life. Detective Inspector Mitchell knew that rapid rewarming could be dangerous, potentially causing cardiac problems or other complications, but the boy's core temperature was so low that immediate action was necessary. They used their own body heat and clothing to create insulation around George while carefully monitoring his responses. George drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words that his rescuers could not understand. His body's automatic responses to extreme cold had shut down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature and protect vital organs. The search team could see that his condition was critical, and they maintained constant radio contact with Dr. Henderson, who provided instructions for emergency treatment until he could arrive. Thomas continued to hold George close, using his body heat to warm the child while speaking softly about familiar things that might penetrate the fog of hypothermia. He mentioned George's favorite activities his siblings, and the Christmas preparations that were waiting for him back at the house. The groundskeeper's calm presence seemed to have a stabilizing effect on the frightened and confused boy. When Dr. Henderson finally arrived with his medical team, the chapel became a scene of controlled urgency. Portable heating equipment was quickly set up, and George was carefully transferred to a specialized warming blanket that would gradually raise his core temperature without shocking his system. IV fluids warmed to body temperature were administered to help restore circulation and prevent dehydration. The medical team's assessment confirmed what the search team had suspected. George was suffering from moderate to severe hypothermia, with a core temperature that had dropped dangerously low. His heart rate was irregular, his blood pressure was low, and his neurological responses were significantly impaired. The fact that he had remained conscious, even intermittently, was actually a positive sign that suggested his condition, while serious, was not at the most critical stage. Prince William and arrived as the medical team was stabilizing their son for transport. The sight of George, pale and barely responsive on the medical stretcher, was devastating for both parents. Immediately went to her son's side, speaking to him in the gentle, loving voice that had comforted him through countless childhood fears and injuries. William coordinated with Dr. Henderson to understand the severity of the situation and the treatment plans. The decision was made to transport George to the estate's medical facility, which was equipped to handle serious emergencies until more extensive hospital treatment could be arranged if necessary. The warming process would take several hours and required constant monitoring to prevent complications. Dr. Henderson explained that George's youth and general good health were significant advantages in his recovery, but the next several hours would be critical. As the medical team prepared to move George from the chapel, Thomas stood quietly in the background, his face showing the strain of the afternoon's events. The groundskeeper had probably saved the young prince's life by insisting they check the remote building and by hearing the faint cries for help that others might have missed. His knowledge of the estate and his attention to small details had made the difference between a successful rescue and a potential tragedy. The chapel, which had been George's prison for 6 terrifying hours, now stood empty again as the rescue party departed. The ancient building had witnessed many family dramas over the centuries, but few as frightening as the events of this December afternoon. The wooden chest that had initially attracted George's attention still sat open near the altar, its contents scattered where he had dropped them when the door first closed, silent witnesses to a day that would be remembered by everyone involved. Dr. Henderson continued to monitor George's vital signs during the careful transport back to the main house, adjusting treatment as the boy's condition slowly began to stabilize. The warming process was working, and George's core temperature was gradually returning to safe levels. His parents stayed close, offering comfort and encouragement as their son fought his way back from the dangerous cold that had nearly claimed his life. The rescue had succeeded, but George's recovery was just beginning. The physical effects of severe hypothermia could take days or weeks to fully resolve, and the psychological impact of the traumatic experience would need to be addressed as well. However, the quick action of the search team and the expertise of the medical team had prevented what could have been the medical facility at house buzzed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Henderson and his team worked to restore Prince George's core temperature and monitor his recovery from hypothermia. The specialized warming protocols required precise timing and constant observation to prevent complications that could arise from too rapid temperature changes. George lay in a temperature-controlled environment, surrounded by monitoring equipment and caring medical professionals who tracked every vital sign. Had not left her son's side since his rescue, holding his hand and speaking to him in soft, reassuring tones even when he was unconscious. The emotional toll of the day showed clearly on her face, the strain of hours of fear and uncertainty etched in worry lines around her eyes. She blamed herself for not noticing George's absence sooner, though everyone assured her that children were remarkably good at disappearing even under the most watchful supervision. Prince William divided his time between comforting his wife and coordinating with security teams to conduct a thorough investigation of how George had managed to slip away undetected. The protection officers were experienced professionals who took their responsibilities seriously, but the incident had revealed gaps in their coverage that needed immediate attention. The prince was determined to ensure such a situation could never occur again. Dr. Henderson provided regular updates on George's condition as the warming process continued throughout the evening. The young prince's core temperature was slowly returning to normal levels, and his heart rate and blood pressure were stabilizing. However, the physician cautioned that full recovery from severe hypothermia could take several days, and they would need to watch carefully for delayed complications such as infection, pneumonia, or neurological effects. As George began to regain fuller consciousness, his first coherent words were apologies to his parents for causing worry and trouble. Even in his weakened condition, the 8-year-old understood that his adventure had created serious problems for many people. Reassured him that the only important thing was his safety, while William gently explained that the family would need to establish new rules about exploring the estate grounds. Thomas had been quietly credited as the hero of the rescue, though the modest groundskeeper insisted he had simply been doing his job. His 30 years of experience at had taught him to notice small details that others might overlook, and his persistence in checking the remote chapel had quite literally saved George's life. The royal family made it clear that Thomas's quick thinking and dedication would not be forgotten. The investigation into the incident revealed several factors that had contributed to George's dangerous situation. The ancient chapel's locking mechanism was found to be faulty, engaging automatically when the door closed even though it was supposed to remain unlocked for family access. The building's remote location and absence from regular security patrols had also played a role in the delay in discovering the trapped prince. Immediate changes were implemented to prevent similar incidents. All remote buildings on the estate would be inspected and equipped with emergency communication devices. Security patrols would be expanded to include previously unmonitored areas, and new protocols were established for tracking family members during their stays at. The chapel itself would be retrofitted with a modern safety system that would prevent anyone from becoming accidentally trapped inside. George's siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, had been shielded from the worst details of their brother's ordeal, but they understood that something serious had happened. They visited the medical facility under careful supervision, bringing drawings and small gifts to help cheer up their recovering brother. Their presence seemed to lift George's spirits and reminded everyone of the strong family bonds that had helped sustain them through the crisis. Queen Elizabeth, who had been briefed on the situation throughout the day, visited George as soon as Dr. Henderson cleared her to do so. The monarch, despite her advanced age and typically formal demeanor, showed genuine emotion as she sat beside her great-grandson's bed. She shared stories of her own childhood adventures and gently reminded George that curiosity and exploration were admirable qualities that simply needed to be exercised more safely. The chapel incident had revealed George's deep interest in family history and the stories contained in the estate's older buildings. Rather than discouraging this curiosity, William decided to channel it more safely by arranging guided tour and educational activities that would satisfy their son's desire to learn about his heritage without putting him at risk. The items George had discovered in the chapel's wooden chest were brought to him during his recovery, allowing him to explore the family artifacts under proper supervision. Media coverage of the incident was carefully managed to protect the family's privacy while acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred. The official statement emphasized George's full recovery and thanked the search teams and medical staff for their professional response to the emergency. Thomas was publicly recognized for his crucial role in the rescue, receiving commendations from both the royal family and local authorities. As George's recovery progressed over the following days, the psychological aspects of his ordeal began to emerge. The young prince experienced nightmares and anxiety about being trapped or separated from his family, normal responses to such a traumatic experience. Child psychologists specializing in trauma were consulted to help George process his emotions and develop coping strategies for any lingering fears or concerns. The incident had a profound impact on the entire royal family's approach to security and child supervision. New technologies were implemented to track family members' locations on the estate, and additional staff were trained in emergency response procedures. The balance between allowing children normal freedom and ensuring their safety became a constant consideration in planning family activities and outings. Christmas Day proceeded with subdued celebration as George continued his recovery. The traditional family gatherings and gift exchanges took place, but with an heightened awareness of how precious and fragile family togetherness could be. George participated in the activities from his bed, surrounded by family members who were grateful beyond words to still have him with them. Dr. Henderson's final medical assessment showed that George had made a complete physical recovery from his hypothermia with no lasting effects. The boy's resilience and the quick response of his rescuers had prevented permanent damage from the prolonged cold exposure. However, the emotional healing would take longer, requiring patience and understanding from his family and caregivers. The chapel where George had been trapped underwent significant renovations to prevent future accidents. Modern safety systems were installed alongside preservation of the building's historical character, ensuring that the ancient structure could continue to serve the royal family while protecting anyone who visited it. The building's door was fitted with a fail-safe mechanism that would prevent accidental locking, and emergency communication equipment was discreetly installed. Thomas was formally recognized for his heroic actions with several honors, including a personal commendation from Queen Elizabeth and a special award from the Royal Victorian Order. The groundskeeper's knowledge of the estate and his dedication to duty had quite literally saved a life, and his actions became a model for emergency response training throughout the royal estates. In the weeks following the incident, George gradually returned to his normal activities with increased awareness of safety protocols and family rules. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of communication and the potential dangers of exploring alone, while not completely dampening his natural curiosity about his family's history and heritage. The story of Prince George's confinement in the Frosty Chapel became part of history, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to maintain vigilance in protecting those we love. The incident strengthened family bonds and led to improved safety measures that would benefit future generations of royals who would grow up exploring the same historic grounds. Years later, George would remember the experience not just as a frightening ordeal, but as a lesson about resilience, the importance of family, and the dedication of the people who work to keep the royal family safe. The chapel, once a source of fear, would eventually become a place where he could reflect on his family's history while appreciating the security and love that surrounded him every day. A tragic end to the royal family's Christmas gathering.